The trauma bay doors didn't swing open so much as explode apart, and the gurney that came through them was trailing blood in long, dark streaks across the linoleum. Emily Carter looked up from her medication chart and saw the man on that gurney, mid-40s, gray at his temples, a chest wound that had soaked through 2 field dressings and was still going, and her stomach dropped before her brain had time to catch up. Not because of the blood. She'd seen blood. Not because of the wound. She'd seen worse. It was the scar, partially visible beneath the torn fabric of his shirt, running in a deliberate line along the left lateral chest wall, old and silvered with age, shaped in a way that no civilian injury and no standard surgical procedure ever produced. She knew that mark. She had seen it on exactly 3 men in her life, and all 3 of them had been declared dead before she pulled them back. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a hospital tears itself apart from the inside, when the people who are supposed to be saving lives become the ones doing damage, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because the stories I bring you don't pull punches, and they don't tie themselves up in neat little bows. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that trauma bay, because what happened next changed everything. Harlow Creek was not the kind of town that made lists. It didn't appear in travel magazines or regional rankings. It sat in a folded valley in eastern Oregon, the kind of geography that looks beautiful in photographs and feels isolating by November, hemmed in by ridgelines and seasonal fog, and a 2-lane highway that discouraged visitors. The town had a feed store, 2 diners, a high school with a leaking roof, and Harlow Creek General Hospital, which served Harlow Creek and about 6 surrounding counties and operated, like most rural hospitals, in a state of permanent resource shortage managed by people who had become very skilled at pretending otherwise. Emily Carter had lived in Harlow Creek for 3 years. She'd come here because it was small, because it was quiet, because the job posting had appeared at a moment when she needed to disappear somewhere, and this place looked like somewhere people didn't ask too many questions. She'd been right about that. Harlow Creek was not a place that dug into people's histories. It took what it got and was grateful for it mostly. She worked nights. She preferred nights. Fewer administrators, fewer meetings, fewer people trying to manage something they didn't understand. The day shift had its politics and its hierarchies and its elaborate social architecture. The night shift had emergencies, which Emily understood, and exhaustion, which she could work with. She showed up, she did her job, she went home. She did not socialize extensively. She did not volunteer information about herself. Her colleagues knew she was competent, knew it in the way you know something you observe repeatedly without ever quite discussing it. And that was enough. What they did not know was that before Harlow Creek, before the 3 years of overnight shifts and quiet mornings and a rental house with a garden, she tended more carefully than she tended most relationships. Emily Carter had spent 6 years as a combat medic with the Army Medical Corps. She had served 2 tours in environments she could not name in polite conversation. She had learned trauma medicine not in simulation labs, but in conditions that made simulation look quaint. She had made decisions under fire that she still replayed at 2 in the morning with the lights off, not always certain she'd gotten them right, but certain she'd made them, and that the alternative had been worse. She had separated from the Army 4 years ago. It had not been a clean exit. There were things attached to her record that she preferred not to discuss, classifications that complicated the story, a period of several months she referred to as a transition, when anyone pushed, which almost no one did because she had become very good at signaling that this was not a door she intended to open. She had kept her medical certifications current, taken additional nursing qualifications, and rebuilt herself into something that looked entirely different on the surface and was, underneath, exactly the same. The night it started was a Tuesday in late October, which mattered only because it was the kind of night that arrived cold and stayed that way. The first real cold of the season, and the emergency department was dealing with the standard chaos of a weather shift. Older patients whose blood pressure didn't handle temperature changes well, a couple of minor MVAs on the slick highway, a farm worker with a hand injury that was going to require a hand specialist they'd have to call in from Medford. Emily was managing 4 patients simultaneously, which was normal, and doing paperwork she'd been putting off for 2 days, which was also normal, and she was halfway through a cup of coffee that had gone cold when the radio call came in. Trauma incoming. Male, 40s, chest and abdominal injuries, mechanism unknown, BP dropping, ETA 4 minutes. She set the coffee down and started moving. The Harlow Creek trauma team was, by rural hospital standards, functional. They had 2 trauma nurses on that night, Emily and Marcus Webb, who was 26 and competent but still learning when to push and when to follow. They had a resident, Dr. Priya Anand, who was good under pressure and knew it, and they had the chief of surgery on call, which tonight meant Dr. Conrad Hale. Dr. Hale was 53 years old, had trained at a program in the Midwest that he mentioned more than was probably necessary, had been at Harlow Creek General for 11 years, and had cultivated over that time a particular style of authority that depended heavily on the assumption that no one in the room knew more than he did. In many situations, this had been accurate enough not to matter. In some situations, it had mattered a great deal. He came through the trauma bay doors 40 seconds after Emily got the call, still adjusting his coat, carrying the particular energy of a man who had been woken up and was not letting anyone forget it. "What are we looking at?" he asked, and the question was directed at the room generally, at no one specifically, which was his way of being present without actually addressing anyone he considered below his level. "Incoming trauma," Emily said. "Chest and abdominal. BP was 60 over palp in the field. They've pushed 2 liters, and he's still not responding the way they'd expect." Hale looked at her briefly, the way you look at a clock, checking the time, not engaging with the object, and nodded. "Get a second large bore line ready. We'll start with the chest." They didn't identify the abdominal source in the field. "I heard you, Nurse Carter." His voice had that particular flatness that was worse than irritation. "The chest first." The gurney came through the doors, and Emily's world narrowed. She'd had this experience before, this particular telescoping of attention where everything peripheral became soft, and the immediate became very sharp. She'd had it in places where the narrowing was because lives depended on it, and she'd learned to trust it. She moved to the head of the gurney while the paramedics gave their report, and she looked at the man on it and she saw, in quick sequence, the things she was supposed to see, and then the thing she wasn't. The visible chest wound. The pallor that went beyond blood loss into something systemic. The breathing pattern. Slightly labored, slightly asymmetric, but not in the way a chest injury typically presented. And then the scar. Old, deliberate, lateral chest wall. She'd seen it on men who'd been through a specific surgical procedure that wasn't available at most hospitals. That was part of a protocol she'd encountered exactly twice in her military career, and both times it had meant what she suspected it meant now. She kept her face still and her hands moving and filed the information. 2 large bore IVs in place, she said. Second leader running. BP is 68 over 40. Fast exam, Hale said, and Dr. Anand moved in with the ultrasound. Emily watched the screen, watched Hale watching the screen, watched the moment when the probe passed over the right upper quadrant, and she saw, briefly, clearly, unambiguously, the thin dark crescent of fluid beneath the liver that indicated bleeding. Not a little bleeding, the kind of bleeding that had a clock on it. "There's fluid in Morrison's pouch," she said. "I see it," Hale said, which meant he was already moving past it, which was the problem, because what she'd also seen, in the half-second before he moved the probe, was the way the fluid was positioned, the way it sat in a distribution that was inconsistent with the visible wound and very consistent with a different injury entirely. "The distribution doesn't match the chest wound," she said. "The primary source might be Nurse Carter." He didn't look at her. "I need you focused on access, not on reading an ultrasound." Marcus looked at her across the gurney. The look said, "I don't know what's happening, but I can tell something's happening." Emily kept her hands moving and kept watching. They worked for 11 minutes. The patient's pressure stabilized briefly at 74 over 50, which Hale took as confirmation he was headed in the right direction. He called for the OR to be prepped. He spoke to the anesthesiologist who'd appeared in the doorway. He made a decision, clearly and audibly, about what they were going in to repair, and Emily stood at the medication cart listening to him make it, and knowing, with the particular certainty that came from having spent 6 years making decisions in conditions where a wrong call meant a body bag, that he was wrong. "Dr. Hale." He turned. The look on his face was the look of a man who has decided what's happening and has been interrupted mid-decision, and it was not a friendly look. The abdominal bleeding pattern suggests a mesenteric injury, possibly a splenic laceration secondary to blunt trauma. The chest wound is significant, but it's not the primary source of the volume loss. The room had gone very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone feels but no one is quite prepared to address. "And you determined this how?" His voice was even, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. "The fluid distribution on the ultrasound. The BP response to fluid, he's not responding proportionally to what we've given him, and the wound pattern is inconsistent with the bleeding volume." "You're a nurse." She met his eyes. "I'm aware of that. You are not qualified to read diagnostic imaging in a trauma scenario." "I'm not diagnosing. I'm flagging what I observed." "What you observed." He said it in the way that emptied words of their meaning. "Thank you, Nurse Carter. I'll take it from here." He turned back to the anesthesiologist. "Or in 10 minutes. She stood at the cart and she understood with complete clarity that she had just been dismissed from a conversation that was going to decide whether this man lived or died. She also understood that there was a formal hierarchy in this room that existed for reasons, and that violating it had consequences, and that she had already pushed as far as the structure would allow her to push. She went back to her medications. She drew up what had been ordered. She did not stop watching the monitor. 6 minutes later, the monitor alarmed. The blood pressure dropped to 42/28 in the space of about 30 seconds. Not the slow decline of a controlled bleed, the sudden crash of a vessel that had been compensating and had stopped. "He's crashing," Dr. Anand said, and her voice was steady, but her hands had frozen. Hale moved to the monitor, looked at the numbers, looked at the patient, and in the silence after the alarm, Emily watched him do something she had seen exactly once before in her career. She watched a surgeon realize in real time that he'd been wrong and freeze. It was 4 seconds, maybe 5, but in a crashing patient, those seconds were not abstract. Those seconds were the thing itself. She stepped forward. "Get me a stat ultrasound, Morrison's and splenorenal recess," she said, and her voice came out in the register she hadn't used in 4 years, the register that was not a request. Marcus moved before she'd finished the sentence. Dr. Anand moved. The tech moved. Hale turned. "Nurse Carter." "He's coding." She didn't look at him. BP 42/28 were losing him. She had the ultrasound probe in her hand and she was placing it before anyone said another word. The screen showed what she'd been afraid it would show. The splenic laceration was catastrophic. The abdomen was filling. She estimated 4 minutes to make a difference, which meant no time for anything except what she already knew how to do. "Push uncrossed O-neg. Run wide open. We need massive transfusion protocol now," she said. "Dr. Hale, I need you to pack this. Splenic laceration, grade 4 minimum. The chest wound is secondary. You go in through the chest and he dies on the table." She was aware, in the part of her brain that was not entirely consumed by the next 4 minutes, that she had just told the chief of surgery how to do his job in front of his entire team. She was also aware that it didn't matter. What mattered was on the table. Hale stood still for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Get me the abdominal tray." And something in the room changed. Something like air pressure, something like temperature. And everyone moved. The next 22 minutes were the kind that collapse in memory. They exist not as a sequence but as a series of images, blood and hands, and the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, and Marcus calling out pressures in a voice that kept getting steadier as the numbers improved, and Dr. Anand at the patient's head with the focused attention of someone who has decided that everything outside this room has ceased to exist. Emily moved through it the way she had moved through rooms like it before, not perfectly, not smoothly, but with the particular accuracy that comes from training that has been tested in places where there was no margin for anything else. At minute 22, the patient's pressure came up to 88/60 and held. At minute 26, Hale called it stable enough to move. At minute 28, they were in the elevator to the OR, and Emily was standing at the medication cart with her gloves off and her hands shaking in a way that she recognized and had learned not to be embarrassed by. Marcus was next to her. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "You okay?" he finally asked. "Fine. That was—" He stopped. "I know. How did you—" "Marcus." She looked at him. "Let's finish the documentation." She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the nurse's station and did charting and drank 2 more cups of cold coffee and answered the questions she was asked by the attending who came on at 6 and did not volunteer anything extra. She drove home in the early light with the windows down and the cold air on her face, and she sat in her driveway for a long time before she went inside. She knew what was coming. She had made the call she'd made, and there was no version of that story where Conrad Hale let it go. She was right. The formal complaint landed the following morning, routed through the chief nursing officer and copied to the medical director and the hospital administrator. It was 3 pages long and it was thorough. It accused Emily of unauthorized clinical decision-making, interference with surgical management, insubordination during an emergency procedure, and conducting a diagnostic evaluation she was not credentialed to perform. It requested an immediate suspension pending review and used language that suggested Dr. Hale had discussed it with someone in administration before filing it. She received it at 10:17 on a Wednesday morning and read it twice, standing in the kitchen of her rental house in her coat because she hadn't taken it off yet. She put the papers on the counter. Then she went to the window and stood there for a while looking at the garden, where the last of the fall tomatoes had finally died back, and thought about the man on that table and whether he was still alive, which nobody had called to tell her, and whether that was because they didn't know or because they'd decided she didn't need to know. Her phone rang. It was the chief nursing officer, Linda Marsh, calling to tell her officially what she'd already read in the paperwork and to ask her to surrender her badge and access card when she came in to collect her personal items. "Is he alive?" Emily asked. A pause. "I'm not in a position to share patient information." "Linda, is he alive?" Another pause. Longer. "As of this morning, yes." Emily said thank you and ended the call and stood there with her phone in her hand and her coat still on and outside the window, the dead garden and the gray sky and the ridge line and the road that went through Harlow Creek and out the other side toward everywhere else. Her badge was on the hook by the door. She'd hung it there the first week she'd moved in, and it had been there ever since, and she looked at it now and thought about what it represented and what it had cost her and what it was going to cost her now. She was suspended. Her career at this hospital was almost certainly over, and somewhere in this building there was a man with an old scar on his chest who was breathing because she'd been in that room, and nobody was going to call her to say that either. That wasn't how these things worked. She took off her coat, she put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her and started reading them again, this time looking not at what they said about her, but at what they revealed about the people who'd written them, about what they thought they'd covered, about what they assumed she didn't know. Because there were things Conrad Hale didn't know about her. There were things this hospital didn't know. And the review board that was preparing to end her career was doing so under the assumption that she was what she appeared to be. A night shift nurse in a small Oregon town who'd stepped out of line and could be quietly removed before she became a problem. They had the paperwork ready, they had the witnesses lined up, they had the story written. What they didn't have was the knowledge that the man she'd saved that night was not who the intake form said he was, and that someone, somewhere, was going to come looking for him, and that when they did, the questions they asked were going to pull on a thread that unraveled something nobody in Harlow Creek General Hospital was prepared for. She folded the papers, put them in the drawer under the silverware where she kept things she needed to find again. Then she went to the bedroom and got 3 hours of sleep, which was enough, and when she woke up, she started making calls. The calls she made that first day were practical ones. She called her union representative, a man named Dale Fitch, who worked out of Portland and who she had never spoken to before, but whose number had been in her phone since her first week of employment because she was the kind of person who kept numbers she hoped never to need. Dale was competent and unsurprised. He had dealt with rural hospital disputes before, and he had the tired, methodical energy of someone who knew exactly how these things went. He told her to document everything, to preserve any records she had access to, and to say nothing to hospital administration without him present. She told him she understood. She did not tell him everything she was thinking, because Dale Fitch did not need to know everything she was thinking. He needed to know enough to do his job, and she had learned a long time ago to give people exactly what they needed and no more. The second call was harder. It was to her former unit coordinator, a woman named Sergeant First Class Diane Polk, retired now, living in Boise, who Emily had served with for 2 years and who was one of approximately 4 people on Earth who knew the full shape of Emily Carter's history. She didn't answer. Emily left a message that said, "Call me when you get this," and gave nothing else, because Diane would understand from the tone that this wasn't a social call and would call back when she could. The third call she didn't make. She picked up the phone and then put it back down and stood in her kitchen and thought about it for a long time, and then made coffee instead and told herself she'd decide about that one later. The review board hearing was scheduled for 11 days out, which was standard, long enough for the hospital's legal team to prepare, short enough that she couldn't build much of a counter case if she didn't already have the pieces. She suspected that timing was not accidental. Conrad Hale had been at Harlow Creek for 11 years, and he knew how the machinery worked because he'd helped build it. She spent the next 3 days in her house, mostly. She went for runs in the mornings on the logging road that wound up into the hills behind her neighborhood, because movement helped her think and the cold air helped her think, and the particular silence of a forest at 6 in the morning was something she'd learned to need in the years since she'd left the army, where silence had been rare and therefore precious. She ran and she thought, and she came home, and she documented. She wrote down everything she remembered from that night in sequence: the ultrasound image, the BP readings, the timestamps she'd observed on the monitor, the precise wording of what she'd said to Hale and what he'd said back. She wrote it the way she'd learned to write after-action reports, which was without embellishment and without apology, and with the understanding that the document might outlast the person writing it and needed to be clear to someone who hadn't been in the room. On the 4th day, Marcus Webb called her personal cell. "You're not supposed to be talking to me," she said when she picked up. "I know." He sounded young over the phone in a way he didn't sound in person. "I wanted to, I don't know, check in. I'm fine." "Okay." A pause. "It's weird here. Nobody's saying anything directly, but everyone knows what happened, and he's telling a version of it that doesn't sound like what I remember." "What version is he telling?" "That you panicked, that you misread the ultrasound because you don't have the training to read it correctly, and then you intervened in a way that compromised surgical management. He's saying the patient stabilized because of what he did, not because of what you did." She let that sit for a second. "And what are people saying back?" "Nothing. That's the thing. Nobody's saying anything back." He stopped. "Emily, the cameras. The trauma bay has cameras. The footage. I know about the footage. Does anyone else know?" "The right people will know when they need to know." She looked out the window. The fog had come in overnight and the ridgeline was invisible. "Marcus, stop calling me. Not because I don't appreciate it, but because you have a career here and I don't want it damaged by association." "That seems like my choice to make." "It is. I'm telling you what I think you should do with it." She softened her voice slightly. "He's alive. The patient. That's what matters right now." "Is it enough?" She didn't answer that because she wasn't sure it was, and she'd gotten in the habit years ago of not saying things she wasn't sure were true. Diane Polk called back on day 5 at 7 in the morning, which meant it was 8 in Boise, which meant she'd been up for hours, which was typical. "Tell me," Diane said, and Emily told her. Not everything, but the shape of it, the key facts arranged in the order that mattered. When she was done, Diane was quiet for a moment. "The scar," she said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "That's a very specific piece of information." "I know." "If you're right about what it means, I know, Diane." Another silence. "You haven't made the other call yet." It wasn't a question. Emily didn't answer it like one. "I'm not sure it's the right move." "Emily." Diane's voice had the quality of someone choosing their words with care. "If the man on that table is who you think he might be, then the people looking for him are already looking. And when they find him, they're going to find everything around him, including you, including what happened in that trauma bay." A beat. "The question isn't whether that call gets made. It's whether you make it or someone else does." Emily stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and the fog outside the window and the coffee going cold on the counter, and thought about it. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't think too long." Diane paused. "You doing okay otherwise?" "I'm fine." "You always say that." "Because it's always true enough." She heard Diane exhale. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "Call me when it's over." The review board met in a conference room on the 3rd floor of Harlow Creek General that was used for administrative meetings and the occasional staff training session, and smelled permanently of dry erase markers. Emily had been in it twice before for mandatory compliance trainings and had found it aggressively neutral in the way only institutional spaces manage, a room designed to suggest that everything that happened inside it was reasonable and procedural and not about power at all. She arrived with Dale Fitch, who had driven up from Portland that morning and who wore a suit that said he took this seriously without saying anything else. Linda Marsh was there from nursing administration and the hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had the particular quality of attention that told you she was tracking everything and revealing nothing, and Conrad Hale, who sat at one end of the table with a folder in front of him and who looked at Emily when she came in with the expression of a man who believes he's already won. There was also a board member Emily hadn't expected, a man introduced as Gerald Fawcett, a physician and external review specialist from the Oregon Medical Association, whose presence meant someone had decided this needed outside input, which could mean anything. The hearing ran for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Hale presented first. He was good at it. She'd give him that. He had the document control that came from years of hospital politics, the ability to make a narrative feel inevitable by the order in which he released information. He talked about protocol. He talked about scope of practice. He talked about the chaos of an emergency scenario and the danger of untrained intervention, and he used the word untrained 3 times in a way that was clearly deliberate, each time leaving a small silence after it, as if letting it settle. He had 2 witnesses. One was the anesthesiologist from that night, a man named Dr. Theo Garland, who gave testimony that was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. He confirmed that Emily had spoken during the procedure, confirmed that her actions had caused disruption, and did not describe what came before or after in any way that put her intervention in context. The second witness was a nurse from the day shift who had not been present during the incident, but who testified to Emily's general pattern of overreach in clinical settings, a characterization that was both vague enough to be hard to dispute and specific enough to imply a history. When it was her turn, Emily opened with the ultrasound timestamp. She had requested the imaging records as part of the review process, which was her right as the subject of the complaint, and she had them printed and organized in a folder that she set on the table without any particular drama. The timestamp on the abdominal ultrasound showed that she had flagged Morrison's pouch at 11:47 p.m. Dr. Hale's documented surgical decision, the one she had contradicted, was entered at 11:53 p.m., 6 minutes in which he had the same information she had and had reached a different conclusion. The patient's blood pressure crashed at 11:59 p.m., she said. At the point of the crash, the documented plan was to address the chest wound as the primary surgical site. The actual source of the hemorrhage was a grade 4 splenic laceration. She set a second document on the table. This is the operative note from the OR. The surgical team repaired the splenic laceration. The chest wound required only drainage and closure. The abdominal injury was the life-threatening one. Gerald Fawcett had been quiet until this point. He leaned forward. Are you saying the original surgical plan would have resulted in the patient's death? I'm saying the patient's pressure was at 42/28 when the plan changed. I'm saying the change in plan corresponded with identification of the actual injury source. The medical literature on splenic lacerations at that severity level is fairly consistent about outcomes without intervention. Hale said, the plan was being reassessed. The plan changed because the patient crashed, Emily said. She kept her voice level. I'm not editorializing. That's what the records show. The room got the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Dale Fitch had been letting her lead, which they'd agreed on beforehand. But now he placed a hand briefly on the table, a signal, and she sat back. My client, Dale said, has provided documentation establishing that her clinical observation preceded the critical deterioration event by approximately 12 minutes. We're asking the board to consider whether the characterization of her actions as unauthorized interference accurately reflects a situation in which a patient was in immediate danger of dying. Patricia Voss, the hospital's counsel, said, the scope of practice question remains regardless of outcome. A nurse's clinical observation, however accurate, does not license autonomous surgical decision-making. My client did not make a surgical decision, Dale said. She communicated a clinical observation to the attending surgeon. When he did not act on that observation and the patient destabilized, she initiated emergency stabilization measures. That's within the scope of emergency nursing practice in the state of Oregon. That is a debatable interpretation. It's the interpretation supported by the Oregon Board of Nursing's Emergency Practice Guidelines, which I've included in the documentation. The back and forth continued. Emily listened to it and watched Hale across the table and watched him do the thing she'd expected him to do, which was recalibrate in real time, shifting his position slightly as the ground shifted, maintaining the posture of authority while quietly retreating from the specific claims that weren't holding up. He was good at it. He'd had years of practice. What he hadn't had was the thing she'd been carrying since that night in the trauma bay, the piece of information she hadn't put in her documentation because she didn't know yet what it meant, and she wasn't going to produce evidence she couldn't fully explain. The hearing ended without resolution, which Dale told her was actually favorable. No immediate termination, the decision deferred pending further review. Hale's expression when they adjourned told her he'd expected something more final. She filed that observation and walked out to the parking lot and stood in the cold air and breathed. "That went better than it could have," Dale said behind her. "It didn't go well," she said. "No, but it didn't go the worst way." He had his keys in his hand. "The scope of practice argument is defensible. The timestamp evidence is solid. If this goes to a full review board, we have a reasonable case." "And if it doesn't go to a full review board?" He looked at her over the roof of his car. "Then Hale's got enough institutional backing to push through whatever outcome he wants, and your nursing license ends up under review and it gets complicated." He said it plainly, which she appreciated. "Is there anything else you have? Anything you haven't told me?" She thought about the scar. She thought about the phone call she hadn't made yet. She thought about Diane's voice saying the question isn't whether it gets made. "Possibly," she said. "Possibly isn't useful, Emily." "I know. Give me a few days." She drove home through the fog and the two-lane highway and the last of the afternoon light, and she thought about what Hale was doing right now. Not in the abstract, but specifically, concretely, the next steps he would take. He'd gotten a delay but not a win, and men like Hale didn't sit with delays. He'd be working the phones tonight, talking to people on the board, framing the narrative in the informal spaces where decisions actually got made before they were formally announced. He'd be making sure that when the full review happened, if it happened, the room was already leaning his direction before anyone sat down. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. Then she went inside and picked up her phone and made the third call, the one she'd been thinking about for a week. She called a number she had memorized 4 years ago and never used, a number she had promised herself she would not use except in specific circumstances. And she listened to it ring 3 times, and then go to a voicemail that identified nothing, gave no name, said only that the mailbox would accept a message. She left her name and her number and 2 sentences. She said, "I treated a patient 6 days ago with a lateral chest scar that matches a specific surgical profile from a protocol I encountered twice in service. I think you need to know he was here." She ended the call. She made dinner, eggs because she hadn't gone to the store and that was what she had, and she ate it standing at the counter and washed the plate and went to bed. She didn't know if anyone would call back. She didn't know if the number still worked or if the person she'd called was still in a position to do anything about what she'd said, or if she'd misidentified the scar entirely and the man on that table was a civilian with an unusual surgical history and she'd just made a call she couldn't unmake. All of that was possible. What was also possible was the other thing. She woke at 4 in the morning to her phone ringing, which she'd expected, and to a number she didn't recognize, which she'd also expected. The voice on the other end was a man's, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to take their time because taking their time cost them nothing. "Ms. Carter," he said, "my name is Special Agent Roy Callahan. I'm with the Defense Intelligence Community's Medical Liaison Office. I understand you have information about a patient." She sat up in the dark of her bedroom. "I do." "Can you tell me about the scar?" She told him. Precisely, the way she'd told Diane, the location, the dimensions, the silvering that indicated age, the specific shape that she'd seen on exactly 3 men, 2 of them under classified circumstances. A brief silence. "Where is the patient now?" "He was transferred to the Regional Medical Center in Medford after OR stabilization. That was 6 days ago." "What's his current condition, to your knowledge?" "I've been suspended from the hospital. I don't have current patient access." Another silence, longer. "Ms. Carter, why did you wait 6 days to make this contact?" She looked at the dark window of her bedroom and the faint lighter shape of the sky beyond it. "I needed to be sure," she said, "and I wasn't sure I wanted to open this door." "What changed?" "Someone is trying to end my career for saving his life. I decided I'd rather open the door than let them close it on me." She heard something on the other end. Not quite a sound, more like the absence of one, the quality of a person making a decision. Then, I'm going to need you to not discuss this with anyone else until you hear from me. Do you understand? Yes. And Miss Carter. A pause. The scar. You said you'd seen it on 3 men. Under what circumstances did you see it the first 2 times? She told him that too. Precisely. It took about 90 seconds, and when she was done, there was another silence, and then he said, "Thank you. We'll be in touch." The call ended. She put the phone down on the nightstand and lay back in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Whatever she had just set in motion was not something she could unset. She'd known that before she dialed, which was why she'd taken a week to dial. She'd learned, expensively, in conditions that had cost people she cared about, that some actions were exits and not doors, that you went through them, and the room you'd been in was gone, and the only direction was forward. She stayed awake until the sky went from gray to pale, and then got up and put her running shoes on and went out into the cold morning, and the logging road was wet with overnight mist, and her breath made small clouds in the air ahead of her, and she ran until she stopped thinking about it, which took longer than usual. 3 days later, she got a call from Linda Marsh at the hospital. Linda's voice had the strained neutrality of someone delivering news they had not been told how to feel about. "The review board has decided to defer the full hearing," Linda said. "Pending some. There are some additional inquiries that need to be completed before the process can continue." Emily stood at her kitchen counter. "What kind of inquiries?" "I'm not able to share that detail." "Who requested the deferral?" A pause. "It came from outside the hospital." Emily said nothing. "Emily." Linda's voice shifted, became something more personal. "Is there something happening here that I should know about?" "I think that depends on what you mean by should." Another pause. "Are you all right?" It was an unexpected question. Not the administrative question, not the liability question, just the human one, the one Linda had probably wanted to ask for days and hadn't found a way to fit into a formal process. "I'm fine," Emily said. Then, because Linda deserved more than that, "I'm okay. I know what I did and why I did it. The rest of it—" She stopped. "The rest of it is going to work out the way it's going to work out." "Hale is furious," Linda said quietly. "He's calling people. He's trying to find out who requested the deferral, and nobody will tell him." "Good," Emily said, and then regretted saying it, not because it wasn't true, but because she'd said it to the wrong person at the wrong moment. "I'm sorry, that was—" "No." Linda's voice was flat and even, and something else underneath it that Emily couldn't quite name. "Don't apologize for that." She hung up and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand. Hale was calling people. Hale was furious. Hale was trying to find out who'd pulled the brake on his carefully arranged proceeding, and nobody was telling him, which meant whoever had pulled that brake was not someone the hospital's usual networks could reach. She put the phone face down on the counter. The next morning, at 8:15, 2 people came to her front door. She saw them through the window before she opened it. A man and a woman, both in civilian clothes that fit in a specific way, the kind of fit that told you the clothes had been chosen to look unremarkable and hadn't quite succeeded. The man was the one from the phone, Roy Callahan. He was younger than he'd sounded, early 40s maybe, with a quiet face and the habit of stillness that either you were born with or you learned somewhere very specific. The woman introduced herself as Agent Marlena Osei and produced a credential that Emily examined carefully and returned without comment. "May we come in?" Callahan said. It was not a question, but he phrased it like one, which she appreciated. She made them coffee, which they both accepted, and they sat at her kitchen table and they told her what they could tell her, which wasn't everything but was enough. The man from the trauma bay was a federal asset. That was the word they used, asset, in the specific technical sense that required no further elaboration. He had been in transit through Harlow Creek as part of an operation that had gone sideways in ways they weren't going to describe, and he had been injured in ways consistent with what she'd described. And he had ended up in her trauma bay because the people responsible for moving him had run out of options, and a rural Oregon hospital had been the closest facility. "Is he alive?" she asked. She'd asked this question before and gotten a non-answer. She wanted a real one. "Yes," Callahan said. "He's been moved to a secure medical facility. He's going to make a full recovery." He paused. in significant part because of what you did. She looked at her coffee. What I did got me suspended. We're aware of that. And? Callahan and Osei exchanged the kind of look that had a conversation in it. Then Callahan said, Ms. Carter, we've reviewed the events of that night. We've reviewed your service record, which is comprehensive. A brief pause on the word. And we're aware of the complaint that's been filed against you and the review proceeding. The proceeding that was just deferred. Yes. Did you defer it? We made some inquiries, he said, which was an answer. We're going to need full access to the hospital's records from that night. The medical records, the imaging records, and the security footage. She looked up. The footage. The trauma bay cameras. She thought about Marcus 4 days ago on the phone. The cameras, Emily. She'd known about the footage. She'd been waiting for the right moment to surface it, not knowing whether that moment would come from her side or from somewhere else. Apparently it had come from somewhere else. Dr. Hale requested that footage as part of his complaint preparation, she said. I don't know what he found in it or what he did with it. We'll handle that, Osei said. It was the first thing she'd said since introducing herself, and the confidence in it was not the confidence of someone making a claim. It was the confidence of someone describing a thing that was already done. Emily sat back in her chair. She thought about the last 11 days, the suspended badge, the cold coffee, the runs in the fog, the careful documentation, the phone call at 4 in the morning at the review board table watching Hale perform his version of what had happened in that trauma bay. She thought about the man on the table with blood soaking through 2 field dressings and a scar that told her what she needed to know before she understood it consciously. What happens now? She asked. Callahan set down his cup. Now we go to the hospital, he said, and we ask some questions. And the answers to those questions are going to have some consequences for some people. He said it simply, with no particular emphasis. We'd like you to be available. We may need you to provide a statement. I'll be available. He nodded. He stood, and Osei stood with him, and Emily walked them to the door, and Callahan paused on the threshold. One more thing, he said. Your record. The full record. Not what's in your nursing file. The work you did in service. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. Why did you leave? She had an answer to this question that she gave to people, a version that was truthful in the way that leaving out 3/4 of something is still technically truthful. She looked at him and decided he probably already knew the version she gave and was asking about the rest of it. It got complicated, she said. He accepted that. He nodded once, put his hand in his coat pocket, and walked down the porch steps to the car, and Osei followed, and Emily stood in the doorway and watched them go. She stood there for a while after the car disappeared. Conrad Hale didn't know they were coming. He was, at this moment, probably at the hospital, in his office, or his surgical schedule, doing the thing that men who believe they've already won do, maintaining their position, working the networks, waiting for the process to deliver what he'd arranged for it to deliver. He didn't know that by the time she'd stood in that driveway in October with the badge on the hook by the door, the thread he'd pulled when he filed that complaint had already started unraveling something much larger than a suspension hearing. He didn't know about the scar or what it meant, or the phone calls that had happened in the dark of early morning. He didn't know that the patient he'd almost killed was not a name on an intake form. He would know soon enough. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She went back inside and picked it up. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 4 words. Records request filed. Stand by. She read it twice, put the phone in her pocket, and went to put on her shoes. It was time to stop standing by. She put on her shoes and her coat and drove to Harlow Creek General for the first time since Linda Marsh had asked her to return her badge. And she sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before she went inside. Not because she was hesitating, but because she wanted to arrive at the right moment, and she didn't know yet what the right moment was. Callahan had told her to be available. He hadn't told her to come. But the text said stand by, and she'd been standing by for 11 days, and she was done with that particular instruction. She walked in through the main entrance instead of the staff entrance, which felt strange in the way all small displacements feel strange. The same route through different circumstances. The woman at the front desk didn't recognize her out of scrubs and without the badge, which was useful. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked to the end of the administrative corridor and sat in a chair outside the conference room and waited. She could hear voices inside. Callahan's and a woman's that wasn't Osei. Someone from the hospital, she thought, The cadence too tightly managed to be anything else. And another voice, male, unfamiliar, with the quality of someone reading from a document. She waited. 12 minutes later, the door opened and Gerald Fawcett came out first, the external board member from the Oregon Medical Association, and stopped when he saw her. Ms. Carter. His expression was doing several things at once. You weren't expected. I was available, she said. He looked at her for a moment and then said, They'll want to speak with you, and went back inside and left the door open, which she took as an invitation. The room had reorganized since the hearing. The table was the same, the chairs were the same, the dry erase smell was the same. But the people in it had shifted. Callahan was at one end with a tablet and a folder. Osei was near the wall with a laptop. Patricia Voss, the hospital's legal counsel, was seated with the particular stillness of someone who has received information and is processing its implications and does not want that processing to be visible. Linda Marsh was near the window, standing, which was unusual for Linda, who was normally the most composed person in any administrative space. And at the far end of the table, looking at no one, was Conrad Hale. She had known he would be here. She had not fully anticipated what it would look like. The specific quality of his posture, which was still upright, still carrying the residue of authority, but altered in some fundamental way she couldn't name precisely. Like a load-bearing structure after the load had shifted. Still standing, changed. He looked at her when she came in. She met his eyes, and then moved past him to an empty chair across the table. Ms. Carter, Callahan said, thank you for coming. We've been reviewing the records from the night of October 22nd with hospital administration, and there are a few things we'd like your input on. Voss said, I should note that Ms. Carter's presence here is irregular given the pending review has been suspended, Callahan said. Not loudly. We've notified the Oregon Board of Nursing and the Review Board Chair. The relevant documentation will be provided to the hospital's legal team by end of business today. A silence. Voss looked at the table. Hale said, On what authority? It was the first time Emily had heard his voice since the hearing. It had the same flatness as before, but the flatness was working harder now, the way a surface that has taken an impact looks undamaged until you look at the edge. The Defense Intelligence Community's Medical Liaison Office, Callahan said. The relevant authorization letters are in the package your counsel received this morning. He looked at Hale without particular expression. Dr. Hale, I'd like to ask you about the security footage from the trauma bay, specifically the footage from October 22nd, 11:40 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. Hale said nothing. Our records indicate a request was made by your office to the hospital's security department on October 24th for footage from that camera during that time window. Callahan set a document on the table. Can you tell us what you did with that footage? I reviewed it as part of preparing my documentation. And after you reviewed it? A pause that went half a second too long. I retained it. We've requested that footage from hospital security and been informed it was deleted from the primary archive on October 25th, one day after your office requested it. Callahan kept his voice level, the way a river is level. Not flat, not still, but moving, going somewhere. Can you explain that? The room was very quiet. There may have been a clerical error. The deletion log shows a manual override, not an automated archive cycle, O.C. spoke from the wall. Manual deletions at Harlow Creek General require supervisor-level credentials. You're listed as the requesting supervisor in the system log. Hale looked at Voss. It was a brief look, the kind that asks a question without asking it, and Voss did not answer it, which told Emily what she needed to know about where the hospital's institutional loyalties were in this specific moment. I want legal counsel present before I respond to any further. You have counsel present, Callahan said, indicating Voss. She represents the hospital. If you'd like personal counsel, that's your right and we can schedule a formal interview at a time that accommodates that. He said it without inflection. We'd simply note that the footage in question has been recovered from the secondary archive backup, which runs on a separate cycle and was not affected by the manual deletion. He slid a second document across the table. We've reviewed approximately 47 minutes of it. Hale's face did something complicated and then went still. Emily had not known about the secondary archive. She had known about the cameras. She had not known about the backup. She kept her face neutral and her hands still and looked at the document Callahan had slid across the table without appearing to look at it. Callahan turned to her. Ms. Carter, for the record, I'd like you to describe your involvement in the patient's care on the night of October 22nd. She described it. She had described it before, sir, in her written documentation, at the hearing, to Callahan himself at her kitchen table. And she'd gotten to the point where she could do it without the emotional weather of the actual events attaching itself to the language. She described the ultrasound observation, the conversation with Hale, the patient's deterioration, the change in surgical plan. She described it in clinical terms because clinical terms were the right tools for this specific work, the same way a scalpel was the right tool for specific work, and she'd never seen the value in using the wrong tool. When she finished, Callahan said, "And the footage we've reviewed is consistent with that account." It was not a question. "I would expect so," she said. Hale's jaw moved. He looked at the wall above her head. The patient's outcome was the result of a team effort. "Dr. Hale." Callahan's voice had not changed and did not change. "We're not here to discuss the patient's outcome. We're here to discuss the deletion of evidence from an ongoing hospital proceeding and the accuracy of the documentation submitted to the review board." Linda Marsh made a sound near the window. Not quite a word. "The documentation you submitted," Callahan continued, "characterizes Ms. Carter's actions as unauthorized intervention that compromised surgical management. The footage shows a 6-minute window between her flagging the abdominal injury and the patient's crash during which no action was taken on her observation." He set down his tablet. "It also shows that when the patient destabilized, Ms. Carter initiated the response while you, and I'm quoting the timestamp here, spent approximately 4 seconds in a documented period of non-response before joining the stabilization effort." 4 seconds. She'd counted them in real time, and she'd thought about them in the days since, and she'd never said them out loud because she'd known how they'd land, and she hadn't needed them to land like a weapon. She'd needed them to land like evidence, and there was a difference. Hale said, "The footage doesn't capture everything that was happening." "It captures quite a bit," Osei said from the wall, "including the verbal exchange at 11:53 where you told Ms. Carter to, and I'm quoting, 'stay in your lane.'" She looked up from her laptop. 4 minutes before the crash." The room was quiet again. Emily looked at her hands on the table. They were steady. She was thinking about the patient, not abstractly, not as a legal point, but specifically the weight of him on the gurney and the sound of the alarm and the 4 seconds of nothing, and then the decision she'd made, and then everything that had followed from that decision, all the way here, to this table, to this room. Fawcett spoke. He'd been silent since Emily arrived, and when he spoke it was carefully, each word placed. "I need to note, for the record and for the OMA's involvement in this review, that if the footage and records are as described, the complaint filed against Ms. Carter does not accurately represent the events of that night, and the deletion of evidence relevant to a hospital review board proceeding is a matter that the Medical Association takes, that we take extremely seriously." Voss said, "The hospital will want to conduct its own internal review of—" "The hospital's internal review," Callahan said, "will need to run alongside the federal inquiry, not instead of it." He looked at Voss steadily. "The patient from October 22nd is a protected individual under federal statute. His treatment record, the circumstances of his admission, and any interference with evidence related to his care are covered under that statute. I want to be very clear about that so there's no ambiguity going forward." Voss wrote something on her notepad. Hale stood up. It was abrupt. His chair moved back faster than he'd intended, and he put a hand on the table to steady himself, and Emily saw it, the small human failure of a controlled exit going slightly wrong. "I'm not continuing this meeting without personal counsel," he said. "That's my right." "It is," Callahan said. "We'll be in touch to schedule the formal interview." Hale picked up his folder and walked to the door and left, and the click of it shutting behind him was the loudest thing that had happened in the room all morning. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Linda, from the window, said quietly, "Emily, I'm sorry. I want you to know." "Linda." Emily looked at her. "I know." The meeting wound down in the way meetings do after the central thing has already happened, the logistics and the follow-up and the documentation of next steps. Emily answered 2 more questions from Callahan and signed a form indicating she'd provided a voluntary statement and understood the parameters of the ongoing inquiry. Fawcett shook her hand on the way out and said something about the review board's findings being updated, which meant her record, which meant the suspension, which she filed and didn't examine yet because there would be time for that. She was almost at the elevator when Callahan came out of the conference room behind her. "Miss Carter." She stopped, turned. He came to where she was standing and kept his voice low, not because the hallway was crowded, it wasn't, but because it was the kind of information that warranted the register. "The patient," he said, "Marcus Teller. That's not a name that will appear in any public record, but he's recovered enough to speak, and he's asked to speak with you." She absorbed that. "When?" "Now, if you're available. He's at a facility in Medford, 2 hours south." She looked at the elevator. She looked at Callahan. "You said he's recovering." "He is. And he asked for me specifically." "He knew your name," Callahan said. "He knew it before we told him anything about what had happened here. We found that notable." She didn't ask how he knew. She filed that question for the drive south, where she'd have time to turn it over. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. "I need to make a call." She called Dale Fitch from the parking lot and told him the suspension was being lifted and gave him the outline of what had happened in the conference room. And Dale said things that indicated he was pleased, and then asked the question she'd expected. What about Hale? "There's a federal inquiry," she said. "The deleted footage, the documentation inconsistencies." She leaned against her car. "It's not over for him." "That's a significant development," Dale said. "Yes." "Emily." A pause. "The footage deletion alone is potentially criminal. If they pursue it, they'll pursue it." She said it without particular satisfaction. "I have to go. I'll call you tonight." She drove south on the highway with the ridge on her left and the valley opening up on her right, and the November sky doing what November skies in Oregon did, which was threaten without committing, the clouds building in the west without quite arriving. She drove and she thought about Marcus Teller, who had known her name, and about what it meant that he'd known it, and about the scar on his chest and the 3 men she'd seen it on, and what connected them. She thought about the 2 times she'd encountered that surgical profile in service. Both times had been in field environments, both times attached to men who were moving through situations that couldn't be discussed in formal debriefs, and both times the profile had indicated a specific type of implanted monitoring device that had been part of an experimental program she'd heard about but never been fully briefed on. She had not mentioned this to Callahan. She had mentioned the scar and the 2 prior instances and stopped there, because she'd learned in 6 years of service that the exact perimeter of what you revealed in any given conversation was a decision that deserved care. She would see what Marcus Teller told her before she decided what else to say to whom. The facility in Medford was not a hospital in the way Harlow Creek General was a hospital. It had the surface features, a building, controlled access, people in medical attire. But underneath those surface features was a different architecture entirely, the kind of place that didn't appear in directories and whose address produced nothing useful in a search. A woman met Emily at the entrance and walked her through 2 sets of access-controlled doors without offering her name, and the room she was taken to was small and plain, with a bed and a chair and a window that looked out onto a courtyard. The man in the bed was smaller than she remembered him being on the gurney, which was always the way with patients post-crisis. The emergency stripped something away, and what was left was the actual person, reduced to their essential dimensions. He was awake. His color was better than it had been any right to be 11 days after a grade 4 splenic laceration and the blood loss she'd watched on that monitor. He had brown eyes and a stillness about him that was not the stillness of weakness, but the kind that was cultivated. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Teller." She sat in the chair. "You knew my name." "I did." "Before they told you?" "Yes." He looked at her without the particular quality that patients sometimes had, the gratitude that made her uncomfortable, the excessive orientation toward her as the source of something. He looked at her the way one professional looks at another, assessing, interested. "I know your record, parts of it." "Which parts?" "Enough to know that the people in that trauma bay didn't understand who they were dealing with." He said it plainly. "That must have been frustrating." "It was routine," she said, and meant it. "People not knowing what you're capable of is only frustrating if you need them to know." He watched her. A faint something at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a reaction he decided not to complete. "They told me what Hale did. The complaint." The suspension. They've suspended the review. That's not sufficient, he said. It was a flat statement, not a moral one. The way you'd say a dosage is insufficient, a reading is incorrect. No, she agreed, but it's where things are. For now. For now, she said. He shifted in the bed, and she watched him manage the pain of it with the particular economy of someone who had been injured before and had learned not to let it cost more than it had to. I want to ask you something, he said. You can decline to answer. Go ahead. The scar. You identified it. That's why you called. He paused. Most people who've been in the field long enough to encounter that profile either don't recognize it or don't say anything when they do. Why did you say something? She thought about that. The honest answer was not a simple one, and it had layers. She wasn't sure she wanted to unfold here, in this room, to this man she'd met 11 days ago over an open chest and a crashing blood pressure. But he'd asked directly, and he'd said she could decline, which meant he'd thought about whether the question was fair to ask, and she respected that. Because someone was going to die if I didn't, she said, and the fact that I might pay a cost for saying something wasn't enough to make me not say it. You knew there would be a cost. There's always a cost. He nodded slowly. The people in that room, Hale, the board, they thought they understood what they were dealing with. They thought I was a night shift nurse in a small hospital who'd stepped out of line. And instead, I'm a night shift nurse in a small hospital who stepped out of line, she said, and some other things. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the courtyard was gray and still. There's an inquiry, he said. The footage, the deleted records. It goes further than just that night. I know. Hale, his documentation history. Callahan's team has been pulling records going back 4 years. He looked at her. There are other cases, other instances where the records don't match the events. She went still. Not visibly. She'd learned not to let things show on her face before she'd decided what to do with them. But inside, something settled into a new configuration. Other patients, she said. Other outcomes. He said it carefully. Not all of them as recoverable as mine. She looked at the window, the gray courtyard, the bare branches of something that had been a tree before the season took it down. How many? She said. That's what the inquiry is establishing. He paused. Callahan will brief you. I wanted you to hear it from me first because... He stopped, started again. Because what happened in that trauma bay wasn't just about one night. You understand that. I understand that. And what you're going to be asked to provide, the testimony, the clinical documentation, it's going to be more significant than a suspension hearing. She looked back at him. Is that a warning? It's a preparation. He said it without apology. I've been in situations where people had the right information and didn't know what they were walking into. I didn't want that for you. She sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet. Down the corridor, someone was talking in a low voice. A door opened and closed somewhere, and the ordinary sounds of a medical facility doing its work moved through the walls. Mr. Teller, she said. The scar, the program attached to it. She watched his face. I've encountered that profile twice before. I didn't tell Callahan the full context. He said nothing. He was very still. I know what those men were doing when I encountered them, she said. Or I know enough. And I know that the program they were part of doesn't exist officially, which means the inquiry Callahan is running exists inside a structure that has to account for that. You've been thinking about this since October 22nd, he said. I've been thinking about it since 2 in the morning when Callahan called, she said. How much of what's in my service record can be used in a formal proceeding? That depends on who authorizes the declassification, he said. And then, after a pause, I can authorize part of it. She looked at him. Your record includes a commendation that was classified at the time of issue, he said. The circumstances that generated it involved a situation I'm familiar with. If my testimony and the declassification of that commendation are included in the inquiry materials. He stopped. It changes what the proceeding can establish about your qualifications, about what you were capable of in that trauma bay. She said nothing for a moment. The commendation. She knew which one. She hadn't seen it since she'd left the army because it didn't exist in any form she could access or reference. It existed somewhere in a file she'd never been allowed to open, attached to something she'd done in a situation that had 3 different classification levels. You know what's in my record, she said. I told you. I know parts of it. The parts connected to you. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The shape of the thing was clear enough. She stood up. She looked at him in the bed with the window behind him and the gray light and the particular steadiness of a man who had come very close to a line and come back and knew the exact distance. I'll provide the testimony, she said. I'll cooperate fully with the inquiry. I know you will, he said. That's not what I was uncertain about. What were you uncertain about? He thought for a moment. Whether you'd want to. Whether you'd decide the cost was too high. He looked at her. You hid for 3 years, Ms. Carter. Harlow Creek, nights, the quiet life. He said it without judgment, which made it harder to hear, not easier. I wasn't sure you'd want to come back out. She thought about the garden with the dead tomatoes and the logging road in the morning fog and the cold coffee and the badge on the hook by the door. I wasn't either, she said. Until I was. She left the facility and drove north in the last of the afternoon light and was an hour up the highway when her phone rang. Not Callahan, not Diane. A number she didn't recognize, Oregon area code. And when she answered it, the voice on the other end was male, unfamiliar, and doing a poor job of sounding like a routine administrative call. Ms. Carter, this is Dennis Faherty. I'm a member of the Harlow Creek General Board of Trustees. A pause. I was hoping we could speak privately, off the record. She pulled into a turnout. The valley was dark below and the ridge was darker above. What about the inquiry? He stopped, started again. Dr. Hale has significant relationships with several board members, people who have been supportive of his work here for a long time, and there are concerns about the direction this is going. She said nothing. I want you to understand, Faherty said, and his voice had lowered, had taken on the quality of someone leaning in, that there are people at this hospital who believe that what's happening, this inquiry, is not in the hospital's best interest, and who think that a negotiated resolution might be possible. That would protect the hospital and what, she said, and might be better for everyone involved, including you. She looked at the dark valley and the darker ridge and the narrow strip of road disappearing into it. Mr. Faherty, she said, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. I'm asking whether there's a way to... You're asking whether I'll go away, she said. Whether the right arrangement makes this easier for Conrad Hale. A silence. I wouldn't characterize it. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I'd like you to think carefully about it. She kept her voice even, the same register she'd used in the trauma bay, the one that didn't rise. The inquiry that's underway is not a hospital proceeding. It is not subject to negotiation by the Board of Trustees or by any combination of people with relationships to Conrad Hale. And the next time someone calls me with a proposal for a negotiated resolution, I'm going to give that caller's name and number to Agent Callahan and let him determine whether it's relevant to the obstruction component of the investigation. The silence was longer this time. I'd recommend, she said, that you not call me again. She ended the call. She sat in the turnout for a moment. The valley below, the ridge above, the road. Then she picked the phone back up and called Callahan and told him about Dennis Faherty, and as she talked, she watched the last of the light leave the sky. And somewhere in the dark behind her on that road was Harlow Creek, and somewhere ahead was whatever came next, and the distance between them was exactly as long as it needed to be. Callahan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me immediately." A pause. Ms. Carter, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. The inquiry team is meeting and we'd like you there. I'll be there, she said. One more thing. His voice shifted almost imperceptibly. The records we pulled from the hospital system tonight. Hale's documentation history going back 4 years. He stopped. Then, we found something you need to know about before tomorrow. Something that changes the scope of this significantly. She gripped the phone. Tell me. Not over the phone, he said. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. But I want you prepared for the fact that what we found, it's not just about one night, Ms. Carter. It goes back a long time. And some of the people involved are not people we expected. The line went quiet. Not dead. She could hear him breathing, hear the ambient sound of wherever he was, but quiet in the way that meant the conversation had reached its edge. She stared at the darkness beyond the windshield. "I'll be there," she said again. She ended the call. She did not start the car immediately. She sat in the dark of the turnout with the engine off and thought about what Callahan had said. Some of the people involved are not people we expected. It was not a small statement. It was not a statement that a careful federal agent made casually. It was the kind of statement that meant the shape of the thing she'd been looking at was not the actual shape, that she'd been measuring the shadow and not the object, and the object was larger. She started the engine. She pulled back onto the highway. The headlights found the road ahead, and the road was empty and the ridge closed in on both sides, and somewhere behind her in the dark. Conrad Hale was in a building or a car or a room making phone calls. And he still didn't know everything that was coming, and neither did she. And that was the part that kept her hands tight on the wheel all the way back to Harlow Creek. She drove back into Harlow Creek at 8:30, and the town was dark in the way small towns go dark early. Most of the lights off by 9. The diner on the main street with its neon sign still going, but the parking lot half empty. She passed through it without stopping and went home and sat at the kitchen table with her documentation spread in front of her and tried to organize what she knew into something she could walk into a room with tomorrow morning. The problem was that what she knew kept shifting shape. She'd started 11 days ago with a suspension and a wrongful complaint. She'd moved through a federal inquiry and a recovered footage file and a patient who knew her name before anyone told it to him. And now Callahan was telling her the scope had changed, that the records went back 4 years, that people were involved who hadn't been expected, and she was sitting in her kitchen at 8:30 at night trying to figure out what shape the actual problem was. She slept 4 hours. It wasn't enough, and it was what she had. She was at the address Callahan had texted her by 7:45, which was a county office building 2 miles from Harlow Creek General that had been requisitioned for the inquiry team. She'd expected something improvised and found something that wasn't. 3 rooms, equipment that had arrived fast, people who moved with the focused economy of a unit that had done this before. Callahan was already there. Osei was there. 2 people she hadn't met, a man and a woman in their 30s, who were introduced as analysts and who went back to their screens without waiting for the introductions to finish. There was coffee. She took it. At 8 exactly, Callahan put a document on the table in front of her, and she looked at it and understood immediately why he hadn't wanted to discuss it over the phone. It was a summary, 4 pages, dense, of flagged documentation anomalies in Conrad Hale's patient records, going back to the spring of 4 years ago. Not all of them were about surgical outcomes. Some were about diagnosis timing. Some were about referral decisions. Some were about patients who had been admitted with one presenting complaint and documented as having a different one. The pattern, laid across 4 years and organized by an analyst who clearly understood medical documentation, was not ambiguous. It was the record of someone who had learned to write charts the way you'd write a legal defense, not to capture what happened, but to make a specific story impossible to disprove. "How many patients?" she said. "We've flagged 31 cases as requiring full review," Callahan said. "Of those, 11 involve outcomes we consider seriously adverse, meaning 3 deaths, 5 long-term complications that may have been preventable, 3 cases where patients underwent procedures that the clinical record doesn't clearly support as indicated." She set the summary down. She picked up her coffee. She didn't say anything for a moment because she was doing the math. 4 years, 31 cases, the quiet accumulation of a pattern in a rural hospital where no one had the bandwidth or the authority structure to see across the whole thing. "The other patients," she said, "do they know?" "Some of the families have been contacted as part of the inquiry process, gently. We haven't characterized what we're looking at. We've described it as a routine quality review." "That's not sustainable." "No," Callahan said. "It won't be after this week." She looked at the document again. There was a name on the 3rd page that she hadn't expected to see, and she looked at it for a moment and then looked at Callahan. "Garland," she said. "Theo Garland. He's listed as co-signatory on 4 of the flagged records." "The anesthesiologist," Callahan said. "Yes. He testified at my hearing." "We're aware." "He was one of Hale's witnesses. He said my actions caused disruption." "He did." Callahan's expression was specific. "Dr. Garland has been informed of the inquiry. He's requested to provide a voluntary statement. He's scheduled for this afternoon." She thought about Garland on the witness stand, the way he'd been accurate and incomplete, the artfulness of it, the way someone who's been doing something they can't fully justify learns to talk about adjacent things instead of the actual thing. She thought about what it meant that he'd signed documentation on 4 flagged cases and then agreed to testify against the nurse who'd interfered with one of Hale's procedures. "He's not the only one," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." Callahan slid a second document across. "There's an administrative component. Someone in the records department has been responsive to requests from Hale's office that went outside normal channels. Not just the footage deletion. There's a pattern of records access that shouldn't have been authorized." She read the second document. The records access logs, highlighted, annotated. Someone had been pulling patient files, comparison records, prior lab results, pulling them and in some cases making modifications that were small enough to seem like corrections and large enough to change the clinical picture. "This is systematic," she said. "Yes." "This didn't start with me." "No, you were—" the word I'd use is incidental. "Your intervention disrupted a procedure that was part of an established pattern. Hale's response to you was consistent with how he'd handled other disruptions. The difference was the patient. Marcus Teller. The asset. The man who'd known her name. If the patient had been a civilian," she said, "this doesn't get discovered. Not this way. Not this quickly." He paused. "That's not a comfortable thing to say." "No," she agreed. It wasn't. It was the part of the truth that didn't feel clean, that 31 patients in 4 years and 3 deaths had existed in a pattern that stayed invisible until someone with the right classification came through on a gurney. That wasn't justice. Justice would have found it sooner. This was something else. She didn't have a word for it that she liked. "What do you need from me today?" she said. "Your clinical assessment of the 11 seriously adverse cases. You don't have to have direct knowledge. We need you to review the documentation and flag anything that reads as inconsistent with standard trauma or surgical care. You have the training to see what the records analysts can't." She nodded. "Send them to me." "They're already on the tablet." He indicated the device to her right. She reached for it. Then she stopped. "Hale, does he know what you found?" "He knows there's a records inquiry. He doesn't know the scope." Callahan picked up his coffee. "He has personal counsel now. A firm from Portland arrived last night. He's been advised not to discuss the inquiry with hospital staff or administration. But he's still at the hospital. His surgical privileges have been voluntarily suspended pending the inquiry. He's technically still an employee." She thought about that. About Hale in his office, or his house, or wherever he was this morning, with a Portland attorney and the partial knowledge of a man who knows something is coming and can't see the whole shape of it. She thought about how that felt, the not knowing, and found she had less sympathy for it than she'd expected. She picked up the tablet and got to work. The clinical review took most of the morning. She sat at one end of the table with the tablet and her own notepad and went through the 11 flagged cases one at a time, and it was not pleasant work. It was the kind of work that required her to sit with details she would have preferred not to sit with, documented decisions that didn't track, timing anomalies that would be innocuous in isolation and were not innocuous in sequence, cases where the postoperative notes described a smooth procedure that the OR record, if you read it carefully against the pre-op labs, didn't quite support. She was on the 7th case when Dr. Theo Garland arrived for his voluntary statement. She heard him in the corridor. His voice, asking something, and Osei's voice answering, directing him to the second room. He passed the open doorway, and she looked up and he saw her, and his face did the thing faces do when they encounter something unexpected in a context that's already stressful, a brief open moment before the control came back. She looked at him for a second and then looked back at the tablet. She heard the door to the second room close. The afternoon came in. The inquiry team worked. She finished her review of the 11 cases, flagged 9 of them as presenting significant documentation inconsistencies, and wrote up her clinical notes in the same register she'd used for after-action reports. No embellishment, no apology, every flagged item located precisely in the record with the specific discrepancy identified. She was handing the notepad to one of the analysts when Osei came to the doorway and said, "Garland's asking to speak with you." She looked up. "With me?" He asked specifically. She thought about that for a moment and then said, "Okay." He was sitting in the second room alone, his attorney, a young woman who looked like she'd driven up from somewhere in a hurry, beside him. He looked like 11 days had happened to him too, which they had, although differently. "Ms. Carter," he said. She sat across from him. "Dr. Garland." He looked at his hands on the table. "I want to say something before the formal statement. You don't have to say anything to me." "I know." He looked up. His eyes had the quality of someone who has been thinking about a specific thing for a long time without getting anywhere useful. "At the hearing, my testimony. I remember it. I was accurate," he said, "in what I said. I didn't lie." "You were incomplete," she said. There was no particular edge to it. She was just naming it. "Yes," he exhaled. "I signed documentation I shouldn't have signed. Over the course of... It happened gradually. One record where the phrasing was slightly different from what I remembered, and Hale explained it as a documentation correction, and I accepted that. And then another one. And by the time I understood the pattern, I was already in it far enough that..." He stopped. "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "I know." He looked at the table again. "The third death. The Packard case, from 2 years ago." He said it like the name cost him something. "I've been thinking about that case since the inquiry started. The record doesn't match what I remember from that OR." She looked at him. "Have you told Callahan that?" "I'm telling them today." He paused. "I'm telling them everything today." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it took to arrive at everything today, the distance between knowing something and deciding to say it in a room where saying it has consequences for you. She didn't minimize that distance. She also didn't find it sufficient to have taken this long to travel it. "Then tell them," she said. She stood up. "That's the right thing to do." She left the room and went back to the main space and told Osei that Garland was ready to proceed, and then she went to get more coffee and stood at the window and looked at the parking lot and the gray afternoon and thought about the Packard case, which she'd flagged in her own review without knowing the name because the documentation anomalies were significant, and thought about whoever the Packard case was. A person, a family, someone who had trusted that the room they were in was managed by people who knew what they were doing, and let that sit where it needed to sit. The call from Linda Marsh came at 2:17. "He's here," Linda said, and her voice was tight in a way Emily had not heard from her before. "Who's here?" "Hale. He came to the hospital. He's in the records department." A sound. Not quite a breath. Something under a breath. "Emily, he's asking for patient files. He's trying to pull records." She turned from the window. "Call security. Do not let him access anything. He's the chief of surgery. His privileges are suspended. Linda, call security right now and then call Callahan." She was already moving to Callahan's office at the end of the corridor as she said it. She pushed the door open. He was on the phone. She said, "Hale is at the hospital trying to access patient records," and watched him process that in real time, the shift from whatever conversation he'd been having to this one. He ended his call. "Right now?" Linda Marsh just called. He was already standing, already reaching for his jacket, already talking to Osei in the doorway in the shorthand of people who have worked emergencies together. Emily followed them out to the vehicles and got into the back of Callahan's car because no one told her not to and because she intended to be there. They made it to Harlow Creek General in 9 minutes, which was faster than it should have been on those roads, and pulled into the parking lot to find 2 of the hospital's security staff outside the main entrance, looking uncertain in the way people look when they've been asked to do something they're not entirely sure they have the authority to do. Callahan showed his credentials and went in, and Emily went in behind him, and they took the stairs to the second floor where records was located and came around the corner of the corridor to find Conrad Hale standing outside the records department door with his personal attorney, a different one now, older, silver-haired, and Linda Marsh between them and the door with the specific expression of a woman who has decided she is not moving. Hale saw Callahan first, then he saw Emily, and something in his face did what she'd been watching it do since the conference room the day before. That subtle structural shift, the load redistributing. "Agent Callahan," Hale's attorney said immediately, stepping forward. "My client is here in his capacity as a hospital employee to retrieve personal documentation from his administrative files. This is within his rights under his employment agreement. His access to hospital systems has been suspended as part of an active federal inquiry. Callahan said. He was notified of that suspension in writing this morning. The suspension of surgical privileges does not extend to administrative access. The notification this morning extended it. Callahan looked past the attorney at Hale. Dr. Hale, you need to leave this building. Hale said, I want my files. Which files? A pause. The attorney put a hand on Hale's arm, the practiced gesture of someone managing a client who is about to say something inadvisable. Personnel files, Hale said. Research documentation. Things that belong to me. We'll arrange for your personal items to be retrieved and transferred to your counsel's office, Callahan said. You are not permitted to access hospital record systems while the inquiry is active. You can't. I can. Callahan said it without raising his voice, and the flatness of it was more effective than volume would have been. And I'd recommend you speak with your counsel before continuing this conversation. The attorney said something in Hale's ear. Hale looked at Emily. She met his eyes and kept her face neutral, which she could see cost him more than anger would have. He wanted a reaction. She didn't give him one. He left. His attorney walked him to the elevator, and they got in and the doors closed and the corridor was quiet. Linda exhaled audibly. That was unpleasant. What was he trying to get? Emily said to Callahan. Callahan looked at her. We'll know more once we've reviewed the specific files he requested at the desk. He paused. He gave the records clerk a list when he came in. She stalled him, which is why Linda had time to call you. He looked at Linda. Thank you. Tell me she gets a raise, Linda said, meaning the clerk. Talk to administration, Callahan said. I'll write a recommendation. The records clerk's name was Bethany Pruitt, and she was 24 years old and had been working at Harlow Creek General for 8 months. And when Emily found her in the break room afterward, she was drinking tea and not talking, which was reasonable. That was smart, Emily told her. What you did. I didn't do anything, Bethany said. I just said I needed to verify the suspension status before I could pull the files. I've been told to verify things lately. Someone put out a memo. Emily looked at her. Who put out the memo? Ms. Marsh. Bethany wrapped both hands around her mug. She sent it to the whole department 3 days ago. Said given the active review, all record access requests require verification against the suspended access list regardless of the requester's position. She paused. Dr. Hale's name was on the list. Emily thought about Linda Marsh sending that memo 3 days ago. Quietly. Without announcement. In a hospital where Hale had been chief of surgery for 11 years. She went to find Linda and found her in her office, behind her desk, looking tired. The memo, Emily said from the doorway. Linda looked up. What about it? You wrote it 3 days ago. Yes. That was before the inquiry team was fully operational. I was aware of the inquiry. Linda folded her hands on the desk. I've been aware of a number of things for longer than I've been able to act on them. Emily came into the office and sat down, something she hadn't done since before the suspension. Linda. Don't, Linda said, not unkindly. Don't ask me to characterize my own culpability right now. I'm not ready to have that conversation. I'm not asking that. Emily looked at her. I'm asking what you know. A silence. I know, Linda said carefully, that over the past 4 years I flagged 3 nursing incident reports involving Dr. Hale's cases to the then medical director. 2 of them involved documentation inconsistencies. She looked at her hands. The medical director at the time was Dr. Patrick Volm. He retired 14 months ago. The reports were reviewed and they were closed as resolved. I was told there was insufficient evidence of systemic issues, and you accepted that. I was a nursing director at a rural hospital with 40 beds and a staffing shortage. Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. I raised concerns through the appropriate channels and was told there was nothing there. What would you have done? It was not a rhetorical question. Emily thought about it seriously. I don't know, she said. Probably the same thing. She paused. Is Volm connected to the inquiry? I imagine he will be, Linda said. I gave Agent Callahan the closed reports this morning. Emily looked at her across the desk. You've been busy. I've been trying to do the thing I should have done longer ago. Linda met her eyes. It doesn't feel as good as I'd hoped. Emily left the hospital at 4 in the afternoon. She sat in her car and called Dale Fitch and updated him, and Dale made sounds that indicated he was revising his assessment of the situation upward in terms of significance. The suspension? He asked. Callahan is generating formal documentation to lift it. Should be by end of week. And reinstatement? I haven't thought about that yet. Emily, I know. I'll think about it. She drove. She didn't go straight home. She drove out to the logging road and parked at the base of it and sat there for a while with the engine off and the cold coming in through the vents. The inquiry was 3 days old, and it had already grown past what she'd expected. Garland was cooperating. Linda had produced suppressed incident reports. Bethany Pruitt had stalled Hale at the records desk. What Hale had been trying to retrieve from that department was not yet known, but the request list was in Callahan's hands, and the specific files on it would tell a story about what he'd wanted to make disappear before the story got any larger. She thought about what Teller had said. Some of the people involved are not people we expected. She'd been thinking about that since last night, turning it over. Garland was expected in retrospect. Linda's suppressed reports added a layer of institutional failure that wasn't surprising. But Callahan had said it before any of that had come out, which meant he'd known something else was in those records, something that hadn't surfaced yet. She was still thinking about it when her phone rang. The number was Callahan's. "We've reviewed the request list," he said. No preamble. "The files Hale tried to pull today. And 12 patient files. 8 of them are on our flagged list." A pause. "The other 4 are not." She waited. 2 of them are nursing incident reports that were filed, processed, and closed approximately 3 years ago. Filed under the name of a nurse who no longer works at this hospital. Another pause. "One of them is a personnel file." "Whose?" "Dr. Patrick Volm, the former medical director. The man who'd closed Linda's flagged reports as unsubstantiated. His personnel file contains a board commendation from 4 years ago. It was co-signed by Conrad Hale." He let that sit for a moment. "We're looking at whether Volm's closure of those incident reports was an oversight or something else." She thought about the shape of it. Hale and Volm, the closed reports, the commendation, a favor documented, a relationship established, a system that had been working in a specific direction for 4 years before anyone on the outside had cause to look. "What's the 4th file?" she said. "You said 4 files not on the flagged list." A longer pause. The kind that meant what came next was not a small thing. "It's your file," Callahan said. "Your personnel file. Emily, he went to records specifically for your personnel file." She was very still in the car. "Why?" she said. "We don't know yet. But given the timing, he received the inquiry notification this morning, he was at the hospital by 2, and your file was on the list." Callahan stopped. "We're treating it as significant. Whatever he was looking for in your file, or whatever he was planning to do with it, he wanted to find something to use," she said. It settled in as she said it, the logic of it clear and cold. "He's building a counter-narrative. If he can establish that I have something in my record, a prior complaint, a disciplinary action, anything, he can reframe my credibility in the inquiry." "That's our assessment," Callahan said. "Is there anything?" A pause. "Your personnel file at Harlow Creek General is clean. 3 years of employment, strong performance evaluations, no disciplinary actions. But my full record is not in the hospital file. The classified elements of your military service are not accessible to him through the hospital system." He paused again. "Which means he either doesn't know they exist, or he does know and was hoping to find something else." She thought about Teller, about the commendation, about the specific things in her service record that had been classified at the time of issue. "Callahan," she said, "the declassification, the commendation Teller mentioned, how quickly can that move?" "Teller has already submitted the authorization request." A brief pause. "Emily, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if Hale is looking for something to use against me, I'd rather he find out what's actually in my record than build a narrative around what he imagines is there." She looked at the dark tree line. "And I'm thinking that whatever he imagined would disqualify me, the truth of what's in that record goes the other way." "It does," Callahan said, "significantly." "Then let's make sure the inquiry board has it before he has time to file anything. I'll follow up with Teller's authorization tonight." He paused. "There's one more thing." His voice had the quality against it. The thing that meant the next sentence was the one he'd been building to. The Packard case. Garland's statement this afternoon gave us enough to request the full OR record and the anesthesia log. We got them an hour ago. And? The anesthesia log contradicts the surgical record in 2 places. He said it carefully, each word placed. It's not a documentation discrepancy. The logs describe different events, which means one of them was written to replace what actually happened. A pause. The Packard case is now a potential criminal matter, not a malpractice case, a criminal one. She sat in the cold car in the dark by the logging road and thought about a name she didn't know attached to a case file on a tablet, a person who had trusted that the room they were in contained people who knew what they were doing, and about what it meant that the log and the record described different events. Who was Packard, she said. 61-year-old retired teacher from Harlow Creek. Came in for a routine gallbladder surgery. He stopped. Didn't leave. She was quiet for a moment. The dark tree line, the cold, the narrow road going up into the hills. His family, she said, will be contacting them this week. Another pause. With a more complete story than they've had. She ended the call. She sat there a little while longer. 3 deaths. The Packard case potentially criminal. Hale attempting to access her file. Volum's commendation and the closed incident reports. The shape of it was not the shape she'd started with. A wrongful suspension, a bad faith complaint, one night in a trauma bay. That night was still the center. But what surrounded it was 4 years of something that had been working quietly, in the ordinary spaces of a rural hospital, beneath the level of visibility, until one patient came through the doors with an old scar and the wrong injury and the right nurse. She started the car. She didn't know yet what the formal hearing would look like, or when, or how the criminal component of the Packard case would unfold, or what Hale's attorneys were going to do with the next 72 hours. She didn't know who else's name was going to come out of the documents Callahan's team was still pulling. What she knew was that she had been available, and that availability had mattered, and that the work was not done. She drove back into town, and the lights of Harlow Creek came up in the dark ahead of her, and she went past the hospital without stopping, and went home, and found, on her phone, a text from an unknown number. It said, "Board hearing scheduled, 48 hours. Federal inquiry has been granted observer status." And below that, from the same number, one more line. Hale's attorneys filed a motion this afternoon to have your military service record entered into the hearing as character evidence. They've characterized it as containing information relevant to your fitness to practice. She stared at the screen. They'd gotten there. Not through the hospital records, those were clean, through something else. Someone had told them something, had pointed them in a direction, and they'd filed a motion to pull a record that contained classified information they couldn't actually access, which meant they were either bluffing or they knew enough to know what direction to push in without knowing what they'd find. The motion would be denied. She was almost certain of that. But the filing itself, the existence of it, the fact that Hale's legal team had made it, meant the next 48 hours were not going to be simple, and the board hearing was going to be the moment everything that had been building in the dark over 11 days came into the light. She put the phone down and went to the window and stood there for a long time looking at the dark garden and the ridge and the narrow road, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who buried things for 3 years, and then had to decide in a very short time how much of what was buried could survive the surface. She stood at that window for a long time, long enough for the cold to come through the glass in waves she could feel on her face, long enough to think past the first reaction, which was anger, clean and hot, and into the second one, which was something more useful. Hale's attorneys had filed a motion to enter her military service record as character evidence. They'd characterized it as containing information relevant to her fitness to practice. They didn't know what was in it. They couldn't. The classified elements were walled off from any civilian access channel, and nobody at Harlow Creek General had the clearance to see them. What they had was a direction, a rumor, or a deduction, or something someone had said in a conversation that had reached them sideways. The motion would be denied. Callahan had said almost certain, which was not certain, but almost certain was enough to work with. What mattered more was what the motion revealed about how Hale's team was thinking. They weren't defending the documentation anymore. They were trying to change the subject, and the subject they'd chosen was her. That meant they'd looked at the evidence against him and decided they couldn't beat it directly, which meant they knew, on some level, that the direct fight was already lost. She called Callahan back at 9:15 and told him she wanted the declassification request expedited. He said Teller had already moved it up the chain. She said how fast, and he said he'd know more in the morning. She said she'd be at the office at 7 and ended the call and went to bed. She did not sleep 4 hours this time. She slept 6, which was either confidence or exhaustion. And in the morning, she wasn't sure which, but it didn't matter because she was rested enough to function, and that was what the next 48 hours required. The declassification came through at 11 the following morning. She was sitting with Callahan and Osei and the two analysts when the authorization landed in Callahan's secure inbox, and she watched him read it with the particular stillness of someone who is recalibrating. He looked up at her when he finished. "It's comprehensive," he said. "I know what's in it," she said. "Do you?" He turned the tablet so she could see the authorization summary. "Because the commendation alone is, Emily, this is not a minor notation." She looked at the summary. The commendation from her second tour, the one that had been classified at time of issue because the circumstances that generated it couldn't be described in unclassified language. The specific actions it documented. The authorization to declassify had come with a brief addendum from Teller's office that she read twice and then set down. The addendum said, "Personnel involved in the referenced action are authorized to provide full testimony regarding the events of record. Classification restrictions lifted effective immediately." "The motion Hale filed," she said. "They wanted my record as character evidence." "Yes." "They're going to get it," she said, "just not the version they were expecting." Callahan looked at her for a moment. Then something changed in his expression. Not a smile exactly, more the way a room changes when a window opens. "No," he said, "not that version at all." The board hearing was held in the same third-floor conference room at Harlow Creek General, which Emily thought was probably intentional on someone's part. Neutral territory that happened to be on Hale's home ground. The room was more crowded than the first hearing. Fawcett was there from the Oregon Medical Association, but he had two colleagues with him this time, one of whom Emily recognized as a senior ethics board member whose presence at a rural hospital proceeding was not routine. Callahan and Osei were there as federal inquiry observers, which meant they could not participate directly, but could object and could enter evidence. Dale Fitch was next to Emily with a folder she'd handed him that morning. Hale was at the far end of the table with his Portland attorney, the silver-haired one, whose name was Beaumont, and who had the easy, considered manner of someone accustomed to expensive rooms. Patricia Voss represented the hospital. She had the expression of someone who had received, in the past 48 hours, a great deal of information she wished she could unsee. The chair of the board was a physician named Dr. Harriet Solis, who had driven in from Portland that morning and who took her seat at the head of the table with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. Emily had done some research on Solis the night before. She'd chaired 9 disciplinary proceedings in the past 6 years. She had a reputation for patience and for not being moved by things that were designed to move her. "This proceeding," Solis said once the room had settled, "is a reconvened review of the complaint filed against Emily Carter, RN, by Dr. Conrad Hale. Since the initial hearing, the scope of this review has been expanded to incorporate findings from the federal inquiry currently being conducted by a team from the Defense Intelligence Community's Medical Liaison Office. Additional materials have been entered into evidence since the initial proceeding. We'll work through them in order." Beaumont said, "The defense would like to note that the expansion of this proceeding's scope represents a departure from standard board protocol." "Noted," Solis said. She didn't look up from her documents. "We'll proceed." It went in order. The original complaint. The ultrasound timestamps. The footage from the Trauma Bay Secondary Archive, which was played on a screen at one end of the room, and Emily watched it with her hands flat on the table, watching herself from the angle she'd never had access to. The 6 minutes between her flagging the injury and the crash, herself standing at the medication cart still moving, still working, while the monitor in the background told the story she'd already known, and then the crash, and then her stepping forward, and then the 4 seconds. Nobody in the room made a sound during the 4 seconds. Hale watched the screen. His face was controlled and flat and gave nothing away. And it cost him, she could see that. The cost of holding that expression in that room while that footage played. Solis asked several precise questions about the footage. She asked them of Emily, and Emily answered them in the same register she'd been using all week, clinical and clear, without editorializing. She asked similar questions of the inquiry analyst, who had prepared a frame-by-frame breakdown with time-stamped annotations. She asked Hale whether he wished to address the footage, and Beaumont said his client would reserve response, and Solis made a note. Then Solis said, "The board has received a motion to enter the respondent's military service record as character evidence. The board has reviewed the motion and the arguments for and against, and the motion is denied." She said it without pausing. Service records are not relevant to the scope of practice question before this board, and the motion as filed does not meet the evidentiary threshold required for admission. She looked at Beaumont. "Is that clear?" "We'd like to register our objection." "Registered." She moved to her next document. "However, the respondent has elected to voluntarily submit declassified elements of her service record for the board's consideration. That submission is admissible as voluntary evidence. The board will review it." Beaumont looked up. We were not informed of a voluntary submission." "You were informed this morning," Solis said. "Counsel for the respondent notified the board at 7:45 a.m. She looked at Dale, who produced the notification timestamp without being asked. Emily watched Beaumont absorb this and adjust. He was good. He adjusted quickly, smoothed his expression, leaned toward Hale and said something in his ear. Hale did not respond visibly. Solis read from the summary of Emily's record. She read it aloud, which Emily hadn't expected, and which meant the room heard it. The deployment history, the training qualifications, the specific advanced trauma certifications that had been obtained in field conditions rather than simulation labs, and then the commendation, the events it described now declassified, read into the record of a board proceeding in a small conference room in rural Oregon, and when Solis finished reading it, the room had the quality of a space that has just had its dimensions revised. Fawcett, from the OMA, said, "For clarity, the commendation describes actions under active fire conditions in a field medical environment. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Emily said. "And these qualifications were current at the time of the October 22nd incident." "They were." Fawcett looked at his colleagues and then down at the table. He made a note. Beaumont said, "The characterization of these qualifications doesn't change the scope of practice framework. The qualifications are relevant to the board's assessment of whether Ms. Carter's actions constituted reckless interference or an informed clinical judgment made under emergency conditions," Solis said. "That distinction matters to the findings. We'll proceed." The inquiry findings came next. Callahan's team had prepared a summary of the broader documentation review, not the full investigation, which was ongoing, but the elements directly relevant to the original complaint and the original complaint's context. The flagged documentation anomalies in Hale's patient records, the deleted footage, the manual override log, the suppressed incident reports that Linda had filed 3 years ago and Volum had closed. Volum's name in the record made Hale's jaw move. It was the first involuntary thing he'd done. Solis asked Hale directly whether he wished to address the documentation findings. Beaumont started to speak and Solis said, "Dr. Hale, I'm asking you." A silence. "I want to address them in the appropriate venue," Hale said, "which is not this board." "The documentation findings are directly relevant to this board's assessment of the original complaint," Solis said. "The complaint alleged that Ms. Carter interfered with surgical management and compromised patient care. The board is entitled to consider whether the documentation on which that complaint was based accurately represents the events it describes. My client, I'll say it once more," Solis said, still even, still patient, with the manner of someone who has said things once more many times and has not needed to say them a third time. "Dr. Hale, do you wish to address the documentation findings?" Another silence. No, Hale said. The rest of the hearing took 2 hours. Emily answered questions. The analysts answered questions. Fawcett and his colleagues asked careful, precise things about the scope of practice framework and the Oregon Nursing Board guidelines and the specific emergency provisions that governed a nurse's authority to act when a patient was in immediate danger. Dale entered 3 precedents from prior OMA decisions. Callahan entered the footage timestamps as formal evidence. At 1:17 p.m., Solis called a recess. They came back 40 minutes later. Emily had spent the recess in a hallway with a cup of tea she didn't drink, with Dale on one side saying things she heard without fully processing, and Callahan on the other not saying anything, which she found more useful. Solis read the findings aloud, all of them. It took 11 minutes. The complaint against Emily Carter was dismissed in its entirety. Her suspension was formally lifted. The board found that her actions on the night of October 22nd had been consistent with emergency nursing practice guidelines, that her clinical observations had been accurate and timely, and that her intervention had been necessary given the patient's condition and the circumstances at the time. Then Solis read the second part. The board referred Conrad Hale's conduct to the Oregon Medical Board for formal investigation, including the documentation inconsistencies identified in the inquiry findings, the deletion of evidence relevant to a board proceeding, and the submission of a complaint that the board found to be materially misleading in its characterization of events. She used that phrase, materially misleading, with the care of someone who had chosen it precisely. The Oregon Medical Board referral was not a suspension, but it was a mechanism, and what it meant was that Hale's license was now subject to a process that operated separately from the hospital, that couldn't be managed through 11 years of institutional relationships, and that had the documentation to work with. Beaumont said his client wished to reserve comment. Solis said that was his right. Hale stood up when the hearing concluded. He gathered his folder. He didn't look at Emily. He looked at the door, which was what men look at when they're calculating exits, and then he walked to it and went through it, and Beaumont followed him, and the door swung back, and that was the last she saw of Conrad Hale in that room. She stayed in her chair for a moment after he left. The room was reconfiguring, people moving, papers being gathered, the administrative sounds of a formal thing coming to its end. Dale was talking to someone from the OMA. Fawcett caught her eye from across the table and nodded, a specific nod, the kind that is a full sentence, and she returned it. Callahan came to where she was sitting. He didn't have the formal manner now, which was different and felt like a shift in the air. "It's not over," he said quietly. "The criminal component of the inquiry, Packard, the records, that moves forward regardless of today. I know. You may be called to testify in that proceeding. I'll be available," she said. "I know you will." He paused. "Emily." It was the first time he'd used her name without the full form of address, and she noticed it the way you notice a small change in temperature. "What you did in October. Not the hearing, not the inquiry. That night in the trauma bay." He paused again. "I've read a lot of after-action reports, a lot of incident documentation. Most people, in that situation, with that hierarchy in that room, would have stood down after the first refusal." He looked at her steadily. "Most people." She thought about what to say to that and didn't find something sufficient, so she said, "He was going to die." "I know." A pause. "That's exactly what I mean." He shook her hand formally and then went to speak to Osei, and Emily gathered her things and walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and took the stairs instead of the elevator, and came out into the lobby of Harlow Creek General. She stood in the lobby for a moment. She'd stood in this lobby dozens of times in 3 years, always moving, always in either direction, arriving or leaving, in or out, the badge that was no longer in her pocket, but had been on the hook by the door every day she'd worked here. She stood still in it for the first time and looked at it the way you look at a place when you're deciding something about it. Linda Marsh found her there. She came across the lobby with her coat on and her keys in her hand and something in her face that she was working on but hadn't entirely managed. "The board findings," Linda said. "I heard them. I mean, in terms of what comes next. For you." She stopped, started again. "The hospital is going to need to discuss reinstatement. I want you to know that from my side, whatever you decide, I'll support it. If you want to come back, we'll make that happen. If you want something different—" She stopped again. "I just want you to know that what happened to you shouldn't have happened." Emily looked at her. Linda was not a person who found apology easy. That had always been clear. And this wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the shape of one, and it had cost her something to say it. "I know," Emily said. "Thank you, Linda." Linda nodded. She pressed her lips together briefly. Then she walked toward the exit, and Emily watched her go, and thought about what it cost people to stay in systems that weren't working right and tried to fix them from inside, and whether that cost was worth it, and decided it was probably different for every person and every system, and she didn't have a general answer. She went outside. The afternoon was gray and cold, and the ridge was visible today, the fog having cleared overnight, and the sky was the kind of flat white that sometimes produced snow and sometimes just stayed flat and gray without delivering on the implied threat. She stood on the hospital steps and breathed the cold air. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diane Polk. "Heard something moved today. You okay?" She typed back. "It moved. I'm okay." 3 seconds later. "Good. Call me this week." She put the phone in her coat pocket and stood there a moment longer. Marcus Webb came out through the doors behind her. He'd been in the lobby. She'd seen him when she came through, but they'd exchanged a look rather than words, which had been the right call in the moment. He came to stand beside her on the steps, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the parking lot and the ridge beyond it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "They told us the findings," he said. "The charge nurse came out and read them to the floor." She looked at him. "What was the reaction?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "People cried. A couple people. I'm not—" That surprised me. He shrugged, the half shrug of someone embarrassed by their own feelings. "I didn't cry, but it was close." "Marcus." "Yeah. Thank you for the call. That first week." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't." He looked at his shoes. "Are you coming back?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the ridge and thought about what Linda had said, about whatever you decide, and about what she'd said to tell her in the facility in Medford, about being in Harlow Creek for 3 years, and the quiet life, and then deciding she was done with the version of herself that stayed quiet. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need a week to think about it." "Okay." He looked at the ridge, too. "For what it's worth. The floor is different when you're not on it." "Different how?" "Like there's something missing that everyone pretends isn't missing." He paused. "I couldn't have done what you did that night." "You don't know that." "I do, though. I was there. I watched you, and I knew what I would have done, and it wasn't that." He said it without self-pity, which made it harder to argue with. "That's not a bad thing. Not everyone has to be that person, but someone does." He shrugged again. "Anyway." She looked at him, 26 years old and already learning the particular weight of watching someone else do the thing you weren't sure you could do yourself, which was not a comfortable knowledge, but was a true one, and there was some value in having it early. "You'll get there," she said. He looked at her sideways. "To what?" "To being the person who steps forward. It's not a thing you're born with." She put her hands in her pockets. "You build it, usually by having done the wrong thing first and knowing what that felt like." He thought about that. "Is that what happened to you?" "That's a longer conversation," she said. "Buy me coffee sometime." He nodded. He went back inside. She stayed on the steps a little longer. The week she'd said she needed turned out to be 10 days. She spent some of it in her garden, cutting back the things that needed to be cut back before winter made the decision for her. She spent some of it on the logging road. She spent some of it on the phone. Diane twice, Dale 3 times regarding the formal documentation of her reinstatement offer and the ongoing inquiry, and Callahan once regarding her testimony timeline for the criminal component of the Packard investigation. The Packard family had been contacted. She didn't know the details of what had been said to them, but Callahan told her the family had responded by requesting full access to the records, which was their right, which was one of the things that rights were for. She thought about that a lot in those 10 days. About a retired teacher who had gone in for a routine procedure and hadn't come home, and about the years between that day and this one, and about what it meant that the distance had been covered only because the wrong person had come through the wrong trauma bay on the right night. She didn't let herself frame it as luck. Luck was too clean a word for what it actually was, which was a set of conditions intersecting in a specific way. Her being in that bay, Hale making the wrong call, the patient having a profile she recognized, her training being what it was, her deciding not to stand down when every institutional signal told her to. Any one of those conditions could have been different. Most of the time, they were different. Most of the time, the wrong person came through and nobody with the right training was there and stood down or stood forward and got removed before the damage could be surfaced. Most of the time, the Packard case closed quietly and nobody pulled the anesthesia log. That was the part she sat with the longest. Not her own story, which had an ending she could live with, but the shape of the larger thing, the way systems developed soft spots that only showed under specific pressures, the way the soft spots compounded over years before they failed, the way the failure usually happened to the person least equipped to bear it. On the 9th day, she called Linda Marsh and told her she'd come back. Linda said, "When?" "Next week, night shift, same as before." A pause. "Emily, you could... There are other options. The board findings. Your record as it's now documented. You could go anywhere." "I know." "Then why?" "Because the floor is different when I'm not on it," she said, and heard her own words come back at her with more weight than she'd intended. "And because I'm not done here." Another pause. "Okay," Linda said. "Next week." She had one more conversation before she went back, and it was not in person and not on the phone. It was a secure message from Teller's facility in Medford, passed through Callahan's office. 3 sentences. The first sentence said he was being discharged that week and would be returning to active duty in a limited capacity. The second said he'd submitted a formal commendation on her behalf to the relevant federal office, citing her actions on October 22nd and the subsequent cooperation with the inquiry. The third said, "You didn't hide this time. That matters." She read it twice and didn't respond immediately and then typed, "Take care of yourself." She deleted that because it was insufficient. She typed, "Don't come through my trauma bay again." She deleted that too because it was the wrong kind of humor. She finally wrote, "I know," and sent it and put the phone down. The day she went back, she arrived 40 minutes early, which she'd never done before. The night charge nurse, a woman named Petra Holst, who'd been at Harlow Creek for 6 years, and who had sent Emily a text the day of the findings that said simply, "Good," handed her a new badge without ceremony, which was the right way to handle it. Emily looked at the badge. Her name. Her photo, slightly out of date. Her department. She clipped it to her scrubs. "Quiet tonight?" she asked. Petra checked the board. "Nothing major yet. MVA came in an hour ago, minor. 2 chest pains on the floor, 1 pending discharge." "Okay," Emily said. "I'll take the chest pains." She went to work. The trauma bay doors were just doors. The medication cart was just a cart. The monitors beeped and the linoleum reflected the overhead lights, and the night shift had its specific quality of quiet that wasn't really quiet, just a different density of noise. And she moved through it the way she'd moved through hundreds of nights in this place and dozens of nights in places much harder than this one. At 2 in the morning, Marcus appeared with a cup of coffee. Not cold this time, actually hot, and set it next to her at the nurse's station without a word, and she looked at it, and then at him, and he shrugged, and went back to his patients. She drank the coffee. She did her charting. She checked on her patients, asked the specific questions, and listened to the specific answers, and adjusted the specific things that needed adjusting, and none of it was dramatic, and all of it was real. At 3:40, an ambulance call came in. Abdominal pain, female, 67 years old, vitals borderline. Emily put down her chart and went to the bay and prepared, and when the doors opened, she was ready. She wasn't thinking about Hale. She wasn't thinking about the hearing or the commendation or the badge or what Teller had written. She was thinking about the woman on the gurney who was 67 years old and frightened, and whose blood pressure was lower than Emily would have liked, and who needed someone in that room who knew what they were doing. She stepped forward. That was all it was. That was all it had ever been. Not a choice about identity or a statement about what she'd survived or a performance of strength for anyone watching. Just the next step, taken because the step before it had prepared her for it, and the step after it would follow from this one. And somewhere in that sequence, in the accumulation of small decisions made in rooms where the stakes were real, was the only version of herself she'd ever been able to respect. She didn't know what the criminal proceedings against Hale would find, or how long they'd take, or what the Packard family would ultimately have access to, or whether the documentation reforms Linda was already drafting would change anything structural about the way rural hospitals handled the Conrad Hales who moved through them with enough authority to rewrite what actually happened. She didn't know if those reforms would reach far enough or last long enough to matter. She suspected they wouldn't, not entirely, not the first time through. That was how systems changed, not in one hearing, not in one set of findings, but in the slow accumulation of records that made the next hearing easier, the next set of findings harder to dispute, the next person who stepped forward less likely to be standing alone. She knew that she'd started something she hadn't finished. She knew that her testimony in the Packard case was going to be the harder room, the one where the stakes were not her career but someone's understanding of what had happened to someone they'd loved. She knew that sitting in that room and saying what she knew clearly and precisely and without flinching was going to be the work, not the badge or the commendation or the way the floor felt different now. She'd do it. She'd been doing versions of it her whole adult life, in places that looked nothing like this corridor, with stakes that had been measured differently. The work didn't get easier. You got more certain about why you were doing it, and that was a different thing, and it mattered. The woman on the gurney gripped Emily's wrist as the team moved her from the ambulance stretcher to the bay bed. Her grip was stronger than her vitals suggested it would be, which Emily noted clinically and also just felt the specific human pressure of a person who is frightened and reaching for something to hold on to. "You're okay," Emily said. "I've got you." She meant it in the medical sense, which was that she had the situation, she had the information she needed. She had the training and the presence and the intention to use them correctly. But she also meant it in the other sense, the one that didn't have clinical language, the one that was just one person saying to another, "I see you, and I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The woman let go of her wrist. The team moved. Emily moved with them. Outside the trauma bay, the hospital ran its quiet night shift machinery. The hum of the elevator, the soft exchange of voices at the nurse's station, the measured beep of monitors reporting the slow, ordinary work of bodies doing what bodies do. Somewhere in Portland, a board referral sat in a queue at the Oregon Medical Board. Somewhere in a county record system, the documentation of a deleted footage log and a manual override in a complaint that had been materially misleading waited in an evidence file. Somewhere in Medford, a man with an old scar on his chest was walking toward a door that would take him back to the work he'd chosen, the same way she was walking toward hers. The woman's pressure came up at 417, stable. Emily made the notation and called the on-call physician and described what she had and what she needed and listened to the response and adjusted the plan accordingly and moved on to the next thing. That was the job. That was what the job had always been, underneath everything else. The politics and the hierarchy and the formal proceedings and the 11 days of suspension and the cold coffee and the documentation and the hearing and the badge reclaimed and the badge reclipped. Underneath all of it, every night, someone came through a door not knowing what was going to happen to them, and someone had to be on the other side of that door who understood the difference between what could be fixed and what couldn't and had decided to stay. Emily Carter had decided to stay. Not because it was easy, not because the system had treated her fairly or would always treat her fairly, or had any structural guarantee of doing so in the future. Not because the wrong things had been made right in any complete or permanent way, but because the person who walked into that trauma bay at 3:40 in the morning when the ambulance doors opened and a frightened woman needed someone who knew what they were doing, had been built over years of rooms that were harder than this one. And that person was here, and the work was real, and that was enough. It had always been enough. The bay lights stayed on, the monitors kept their count. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened, and the sound of the ordinary night came through it, and Emily Carter, who had been a soldier and was a nurse and had never been only one thing, moved through the room with her hands steady and her attention clear, doing what she'd always done in the spaces where it mattered. She showed up. She stayed.